Hayden Panettiere's death, at just 36 years old, caught many people completely by surprise. She was a woman who had been in front of cameras since she was a baby, who spent practically her entire life being watched by the public, and who became internationally known through productions such as Heroes, Nashville, and Scream. Hayden was found unresponsive at her home in Greenville, South Carolina on Sunday, August 16. Emergency responders encountered her in cardiac arrest, but cardiac arrest does not tell us what caused her death. At this point, the official cause remains pending. The preliminary autopsy found no signs of trauma, and authorities have said there are no indications of foul play. For that reason, I don't want to fill that silence with an answer that does not yet exist. The medical investigation needs to follow its course. What interests me here is a different question. What does Hayden's life reveal when we look at the cycles surrounding the final period of her journey? We are talking about a woman who died only 5 days before her 37th birthday. She was born on the 21st of August, 1989, and passed away just as another personal cycle was coming to an end. For those of us who work with numerology and spirituality, that proximity to her birthday is worth examining carefully. Hayden was born on the 21st, which reduces to the number 3. 3 is strongly connected with communication, expression, art, creativity, image, and the need to express something that exists within. When we look at her story, that vibration appears almost immediately. Hayden began working in front of cameras when she was still a child. Her first commercial appearance came when she was only 11 months old. Television followed, then film, music, and eventually a professional life built almost entirely around expression. But the number 21 interests me for another reason. It combines the two, associated with sensitivity, emotional bonds and perception, with the 1, associated with individuality, strength, and the need to find one's own direction. Together, those energies can symbolically describe someone who appears extremely expressive on the outside while carrying a much more complicated emotional world within. I am not saying that a number explains someone's life. I am looking at a symbolism that, in Hayden's case, connects remarkably well with a public journey marked by early success and very difficult personal periods. She grew up in front of a camera before she was even old enough to decide whether she wanted that level of exposure. When Heroes became a worldwide phenomenon in 2006, Hayden was still very young. Claire Bennett put her face in front of millions of people and turned her into an international celebrity. Then came Nashville, another major chapter in her career, and interestingly, a character whose story also involved fame, pressure, ambition, and personal conflict. Her professional life continued to grow while the woman behind that public image was dealing with battles the audience did not fully understand at the time. Years later, Hayden herself spoke openly about some of those struggles. She discussed her problems with alcohol and publicly shared her experience with postpartum depression. There was a long period away from acting, followed by an attempt to rebuild her professional life, including her return as Kirby Reed in Scream 6 in 2023. These are parts of her story that she chose to make public herself. And they matter because reducing her entire life to the still unknown circumstances surrounding her death would be deeply unfair. Her birth numerology presents another striking combination. When the 21st of August 1989 is reduced according to a common numerological method, we arrive at 11. I preserve 11 rather than immediately reducing it, because many numerological traditions consider it a master number. 11 is often associated with intuition, inspiration, magnetism, heightened perception, and emotional intensity. Symbolically, it can describe people who have an extraordinary ability to reach others while also facing the challenge of managing everything they absorb and experience internally. That symbolism fits an interesting contradiction in HAYDEN's public life. Millions of people knew the character she played. Very few people truly knew the woman who went home when the cameras stopped rolling. Her life would also be marked by a devastating family loss. In 2023, her younger brother, Jensen Panettiere, died at only 28 years old. HAYDEN later spoke publicly about the profound impact his death had on her. Losing someone that close changes the way a person experiences time, family, memory, and sometimes life itself. I would never claim that her brother's death spiritually caused what happened to HAYDEN. There is no basis for making that connection. But I also would not erase from her story the weight of a loss that we know affected her deeply. There is another numerical coincidence worth noticing. HAYDEN was approaching her 37th birthday. 3 plus 7 equals 10, and 1 plus 0 brings us back to 1. The number 1 represents the opening of a cycle, individuality, movement, and beginning again. HAYDEN passed away only days before crossing that birthday threshold. That does not mean numerology predicted her death. It is always easy to take numbers after a tragedy and force them to explain an outcome we already know. That is not what I want to do here. What makes this interesting is simply that her passing occurred at the boundary between two periods of her life. The official cause of death remains under investigation, and speculation should not be presented as truth. What we can look at is the extraordinary amount of life HAYDEN experienced in only 36 years. Childhood fame, international recognition, motherhood, enormous public exposure, personal struggles, family loss, time away from acting, and attempts to rebuild. There was an incredible amount of movement compressed into a relatively short life. From a spiritual perspective, that is where my attention goes first. Not toward the mystery of her death, toward everything she carried while she was alive. And perhaps that is where HAYDEN Panettiere's story begins to leave something important for those of us who are still here. At 36, HAYDEN was going through a numerological period worth examining. Using one of the most common methods for calculating a personal year, combining the day and month of birth with the universal year, her numbers for 2026 lead us to the vibration of 3. And I find that particularly interesting because 3 appears once again in the life of a woman born on the 21st. Another number that reduces to 3. 3 speaks about voice, communication, creativity, visibility, and expression. And during the final period of HAYDEN's life, she had begun speaking about herself with an openness that had not always been possible. Shortly before her death, she released her memoir, This Is Me. In it, she chose to address painful aspects of her own journey, including the effects of childhood fame, her struggles with alcohol, and other difficult periods of her life. That changes the way I interpret this final chapter spiritually. I do not simply see someone disappearing into silence. I see someone who, before leaving, had begun organizing and publicly expressing parts of her own story that had spent years hidden behind the actress everyone thought they knew. The symbolism is difficult for me to ignore. For practically her entire life, other people wrote characters for HAYDEN to play. They gave her lines, they gave her costumes, they gave her stories, they gave her personalities, and toward the end of her life, HAYDEN finally decided to put her own story into words. No Claire Bennett, no Juliette Barnes. HAYDEN speaking about HAYDEN. For someone whose numerology carries the 3 and 11 so strongly, expression and exposure almost become two sides of the same coin. The ability to reach enormous numbers of people while simultaneously having to discover where the public image ends and the private human being begins. The death of her younger brother Jensen also belongs to this story. He died in 2023 at just 28 years old. And HAYDEN publicly discussed how profoundly that loss affected her. I will not turn his death into a spiritual explanation for hers. We have no basis for doing that. What we can say is that grief changes people. There are losses after which you continue living, working, laughing, and making plans, but a part of your personal history never returns to exactly where it was before. That is why I prefer to speak about emotional cycles rather than search for a hidden omen in the date of her death. Spirituality can become very misleading when it is used only to search backward for signs after somebody dies. Once we already know the ending, almost any number can be made to look extraordinary. The deeper lesson appears when we look at what happened during the person's life. HAYDEN experienced something millions of people dream about without necessarily understanding its cost: fame at an extremely young age. There is an enormous romanticization of being famous, successful, wealthy, appearing on television, and having millions of people recognize your face. But a child does not have the same emotional structure as an adult to separate identity from public approval. When someone grows up being constantly evaluated through ratings, appearance, performance, criticism, and expectations, adulthood can bring a very complicated question. Who am I when nobody is watching? I am not claiming that childhood fame explains HAYDEN's personal struggles. That would be speculation. I am saying that her story gives us an opportunity to think about something our culture rarely discusses when celebrating young celebrities. HAYDEN herself chose to make some of her struggles public, and she spent years attempting to rebuild parts of her life. Her return to acting in Scream 6 was seen by many fans as an important comeback after a long absence. And now, we also need to be careful about what happens after her death. Whenever a famous person dies young and the official cause has not yet been determined, rumors immediately begin filling the empty spaces. Theories appear. People search old interviews for clues. Every photograph suddenly becomes evidence of something. But questions are not answers. Until the investigation is complete, we should not turn speculation into certainty. Spiritually, I am comfortable respecting that silence. I do not need to know exactly what happened during the final minutes of HAYDEN Panettiere's life to find meaning in the 36 years that came before them. A little girl began working almost before she could speak. She grew up in front of cameras. She became internationally famous. She became a mother. She experienced difficult relationships. She faced personal struggles. She lost her brother. She stepped away. She tried to rebuild. She returned to the screen. And eventually, she decided to tell her story in her own voice. That is already an extraordinary amount of life. For anyone watching this who may also be carrying a battle that nobody else can see, HAYDEN's story leaves us with something far more valuable than trying to guess what caused her death. Do not wait until you reach your limit before acknowledging that something needs care. Looking strong does not mean someone is not suffering. Success does not protect a person from grief. Money does not eliminate loneliness. Recognition does not automatically bring peace. And starting over after falling does not make anyone weak. I also do not believe suffering should ever be interpreted as spiritual failure. That idea has hurt too many people. Faith can sustain us through extraordinarily difficult moments, but spirituality should never become a weapon used to blame someone for what they are experiencing. Hayden died 5 days before turning 37. The birthday that would have opened another cycle never arrived for her. Naturally, that makes us search for meaning. But perhaps not every departure comes with a perfect explanation. Some leave questions, some leave memories, and some force us to look more carefully at the people who are still beside us. HAYDEN PANETTIERE will be remembered for characters that reached millions of people around the world, particularly through Heroes in Nashville. But a human being can never be contained entirely within the characters they played. Away from the screen, there was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a woman whose story was far greater than what the audience was ever able to see. May her memory be treated with respect, especially while her family is living through such a painful loss. May her daughter be surrounded by love and protection. May the people who loved Hayden find strength in the middle of this absence. And may HAYDEN PANETTIERE be remembered not only for the unexpected way her life ended at 36, but for everything she managed to leave behind during the years she was here.